So this is chapter 7 by Raymond Panikkar, and this is the book Cultural Disarmament, and this chapter is called Peace as Harmony, Freedom and Justice. So he begins with saying that peace today constitutes one of the few positive symbols having meaning for the whole of humanity. Peace is the most universal, unifying symbol possible. It is one of the few symbols to which the human race responds positively. God, who for some time had been the unifying symbols for many cultures, is no longer the center of human activities. So essentially, he's saying that peace has replaced religion, that peace has replaced even God, which is not to say that people don't pray or don't have faith, but instead of going to God, it is the ideal that they seek, not really a person or not an idol, an ideal, not an idol. That's a great way to understand it. And another reason why that is because the symbol of God has ceased to be universal, not only because of the wars that have been waged in the divine name, but also because, rightly or wrongly, a considerable part of human consciousness sees in the theisms the last residue of a monarchical conception of reality fated to disappear. Which is why I said ideal, not idol. So if you idolize someone, there is some kind of hierarchy that is implied in that, where somebody is at the top and everybody else comes under him or her or them. So since we are a culture of democracy, we reject monarchy, and there is this intellectual understanding of God as being a kind of monarch. So we would rather preach and propagate and idealize ideals themselves rather than any embodiment of them in a person or an or entity. But then he also says that neither a certain conception of democracy or a certain economic welfare a universal symbol. Man aspires to be something more. So he's also saying that, so not even idols, but we don't even want structures. So anything that can limit us. So because ideals are abstract, ideals can be anything. They can be they are a figment of our, not a figment of our imagination, but they let us run. Our imagination can run away with ideals, but when we have given them a face, when we've given them we've made them rule bound, man now feels trapped. So it is in that desire to be free, to break away, that we now go towards ideals and not structures and idols. So he understands peace as a triadic structure, and I'll show you the diagram he's made. Oops, 1 second. It's this one. So you can see that he has given 3 equal segments to 3 different elements of peace. One is freedom, justice, and harmony. So I'll start with harmony. So harmony is at the base. Below at the base, harmony, the maximum value in Chinese culture, is as it may be the minimum in the current Western culture. He really hates the modern culture, doesn't he? Well, it's a stupid culture. Although it has been cultivated and loved in the West since the time of the Greeks. To say harmony is tantamount to saying balance. And by balance, he means accept nothing, reject nothing, have a kind of, okay, I think I'm getting ahead of myself, but should I? He's talking about a cosmic order, everything in its place, even darkness, even evil. And the reason why I have allowed myself to get ahead is because I want you to remember Tagore when I say that. See, remember how he talked about truth being like a tree, and I think I gave that example in the video, truth being like a tree and falsehood being its shadow. So the tree and the shadow must necessarily coexist, even as we know that a shadow relies on the tree for its existence, and how the relationship is it's a imbalance, in as much as there is an absolute good but not an absolute evil. But he never says that there cannot, he also says that why is there imperfection, why is there evil, we must accept that it must be so, because if there were not, then life as we know it wouldn't exist. That certain laws, certain phenomenons, they exist for our own good, even as we don't see it, even as we see the problems in it, but we also see how they are necessary um, for allowing us to do, allowing they have a reliable element to it. I know I'm getting really deep into Tagore, but I really do want you to remember that because Panekar will say that as well, that we don't want to believe that bad things happen or suffering, that human life is necessarily human suffering. But we also must recognize that there not only is meaning in suffering, but that meaning is necessary for our growth, for us to reach our highest selves, for us to understand that meaning, and that meaning is what life is about, and that meaning is achieved through suffering. So that's what he means by harmony between all parts of life, all aspects of life, the good and the bad. So, and he very clearly says here, everything should be integrated and nothing ought to be discarded. There is no such thing as absolute evil. Remember Rabindranath Tagore. Harmony here is a harmony between the inner and the outer, the body and the soul, the natural and the cultural, the masculine and the feminine, and so on. Harmony among all sectors of reality. A goodly number of human cultures fail to comprehend that there can ever be a peculiar harmony between good and evil. So he also says that people who think that are people who think in a dualistic sense, who think it's either or, not and. So harmony is that and. It is this and it's that. It's not this or that. You can't choose. It's both. Accept everything, reject nothing. Harmony is difficult to perceive when we adopt an exclusively vertical or an exclusively horizontal scale of values. When all is said and done, harmony cannot be perceived only from without. Again, remember Rabindranath? One must be in the midst of it as well. Harmony can enable us to understand what we have said above, namely, that victory even of the good guys never leads to peace. So you understand how he's kind of weaving everything together. He's saying that first thing, that it cannot be perceived only from without, which is that harmony cannot be had from scarcity, but harmony cannot also be had from abundance. The scarcity is the bad and abundance is the good, which is why he says it cannot be had without the good. It cannot be perceived only from without, and victory, even that of the good guys, never leads to peace. So it has to be a mix of both. Harmony has to be some kind of cosmic coming together, a whole. So harmony also means that it's a space where there is room for all, without unitary reductionisms. One of the most paradoxical and extraordinary sentences in literature is represented by Dante's effort to explain this fundamental harmony, which is that hell is the work of wisdom and love. Over the gates of hell, an inscription proclaims that this place has been created by the Holy Trinity, La Divina Potestat, Soma Sapienza, El Primo Amore. Wow, I did a very good job explaining. I think he just means that if this harmony disappears from our consciousness, then the traditional hell loses its raison d'etre. It does not exist. It is an aberration. Catherine of Genoa went on even further. To the question whether everything could exist that would be worse than hell, where she replied, yes, if it did not exist. Without it, no just harmony would not be possible. No just harmony would be possible in the medieval worldview. I want you to understand this as a truism and not as an intellectual pursuit, because I think intellectually, no, you won't be able to understand why hell needs to exist, because you'll constantly try to rationalize it. You'll constantly be like, why does there need to be a bad? That says a lot about the fact that good is not that good. But please, I would like you to shed that sort of lower level of thinking and try to understand it as an experience. Try to remember and reflect on moments in your life when you reached a kind of rock bottom, and through it you emerged a better, greater individual, and how that wisdom, that experience of hell has taught you love and wisdom, and how without that hell perhaps you wouldn't have had, right? There's this whole thing now that without a breakthrough, a breakthrough often looks like a breakdown. And there's also a really beautiful sort of little short saying by Franz Kafka. It really encompasses what he's trying to say here. Anyway, moving on. And so he explains how this paradox, he explains this paradox of why hell must exist for there to be harmony. This may be the most profound paradoxical expression of the meaning of harmony. Without harmony, and we can say without inner, outer, political, and so on, it is impossible to speak of the experience and reality of peace. Peace is harmony, not even hell destroys it. Hell is the dialectical possibility of harmony in the comprehensive conception of reality as maintained by many traditional religions. Essentially, he's just saying that you have to understand the that not only must hell exist for us to understand harmony, in as much in that harmony means a cosmic union of everything, but also understand that despite its existence, despite the pain and the bloodshed and the, you know, that it does not have the power, it cannot win the battle against love, against peace. So I'm just gonna leave this reflection at that, and I would just like you to think about it. And like I said, don't think about it intellectually, but just, like really let it sink in and think from your gut, where all of us know what he's saying is true, but our rational minds are like, but. However many times you might question this wisdom, you will arrive at the same conclusion. I can guarantee you that. Trust me, I tried. We cite these examples in order to show that neither is harmony a bucolic ideal, not peace a honeymoon. It is another matter whether the worldview today ought to be the same as that of our medieval predecessors. So the central... There must be an interrelationship amongst the parts of a whole in order there to be harmony. But he's saying that harmony implies totality. So first he's saying that we are not saying that harmony is some kind of idealism, and although we are implying that harmony must necessarily there must be an interrelationship of all the parts for there to be a whole. But what he is really saying is that harmony is that whole, that it implies a totality, that there does exist a kind of cosmic order that I have been constantly implying. Sometimes harmony embraces subject and object, knower and known. And the second thing he's also saying is that by its very nature, harmony belongs to the ultimate structure of the universe. So both of them are kind of the same thing. They're very interlinked, but also different. Then he says that if all the processes of the universe were to function in some other way, that way would be the ultimate model. And on that basis, we would be able to pass judgment on everything that is. That would be the harmonious way. So he's also saying here that it is not that harmony is the way the universe is today. If the structure of the universe changed and became something else, harmony would be that union, that structure, that totality. That the universe is harmonious is qualified tautology. What ought to be cannot ultimately depend on more than what is. So then he says that for us, this means that harmony, which is a dimension of peace, cannot be an ideal conception of ours, a projection of ours of what harmony ought to be. In other words, peace cannot be imposed from without. Peace must not be identified with our conception of peace. Peace must be founded in the very nature of things, founded in the real harmony of the universe. So, again, he's talking about how it cannot be a construction either of the bad kind or of the good kind. It must be natural. For example, if it is true that the material universe subsists thanks to the fact that the big fish eats the little fish, then harmony and peace cannot consist in managing to keep people from hunting, although it will demand that they hunt according to the natural rhythm of things, in order to subsist, not to accumulate, in order to share in the universal symbiosis, not to make money, and so on. In a word, peace cannot be anti-natural or violent, although of course these notions are open to various interpretations. So what he means to say here is that if there is a law of, what do you call it, the law of the jungle, right? That I don't know if you all know this fact, but I think this is a lion or a tiger, that they eat their own, and they do that to maintain the population of the jungle. And so he's essentially saying that even death has its place, and if that death is natural, if it is done to maintain the natural order of things, then it is justified. However, there would be ethics to make sure that there is no excess and there is no scarcity, but to say that that should not be is to miss the point of the totality of things, to miss the point of creation itself. That creation remains constant, that destruction is a part of creation, but creation is an inevitability, it's a certainty, it's an eternity, and destruction is just a part of it. Pythagoras, according to Porphyry, what? He taught that in nature, a thing has a beginning, a middle, and an end. On the basis of this form and this nature, the number 3 has been proclaimed. Remember, I spoke about this in my vlog. Without entering into Pythagorean numerology, let us recall that 3 is traditionally the perfect number. It expresses the harmony of everything that exists. Peace as well has a triadic structure. It is more than a dual tension or a monarchical dominion. It implies a relation, so to speak, which is never closed up in a monoistic short circuit or exhausted in a dualistic struggle. Peace seems to require a constant flux from one thing to another, without ever a return by the same route, an ongoing giving and receiving. Remember Rabindranath talking about reciprocity? Remember also that okay, wait, I'll get to that. This is what we mean to suggest when we indicate that the basis of peace is harmony. All problems of existence are essentially problems of harmony. So, I wanted to bring to your notice also another thing, that the idea of in nature having a beginning, middle, and end. So, in spirituality, if you read works of Rabindranath Tagore and if you read Panikkar, he would understand they both would understand this beginning, middle, and end as a cycle, which is also why the peace is represented by a circle and not, a straight line. And so this also implies the problem with the modern world and its notion of time being linear. And I think I have spoken about this in one of my Tagore videos or in Gandhi videos, I don't know. So you also have to see, and again, through that I also want to imply something I've been implying in all of these videos, which is what the notion of the physical and the spiritual world. If you read this in its physical, if in its literal physical sense, even you would understand time to be this. But if you see it from a spiritual, from an inner perspective, from the spiritual world, you'll understand it as this. And so the modern world often sees it as this. It often focuses on the exterior, on the physical, while the spiritual world will focus on the interior. Although eventually Panikkar will tell you that peace cannot be solely one or the other, it's both. In the segment on the left of the peace sign is freedom. And here, left has a certain political connotation. A certain ideology of the left seems more sensitive to freedom than to order. So here he's essentially talking about how when we think of freedom, we think of left-wing politics and not necessarily right-wing politics. And then later into the reading, he will explain why that is. Not immediately, but late. Just have some patience. Freedom does not mean freedom of choice. A wider range of choices is sometimes consonant with a diminished freedom. To be able to choose this or that in a supermarket, or to be able to vote for that candidate or this along a limited spectrum of possibilities, means a very relative freedom, and sometimes merely an apparent one. The options are restricted to what the supply offers. Man's freedom is antecedent to and deeper than the ability to choose. Freedom means absence of determination from without, from dependency, from alien influences, in such a way that my being can manifest itself, develop according to what it is, without coercion from without or indoctrination from within. Freedom consists in doing, in thinking, acting, and so on, in conformity with what one is. So I'm gonna let this sink in with you all a little bit, and explain what he means by within and without. So by without, he's talking about a kind of scarcity. So he means that how can one talk about the idea of choice in in a space where there is where there is scarcity. So that's why he means freedom means absence of determination from without. So if I have no choice except these two choices because there is a scarcity of choices and so I pick A or B, that is not freedom of choice. That is that shows the limitation within which I have to make that choice, and hence that choice can never be free. And we can understand that in today's political context, right? We have to constantly choose between two or three evils, that we don't have a good choice. And a lot of people, they're like, why should I do nota? Nota does me no good. I might as well either not vote or vote for the lesser evil. And so, like, none of these options really, they're not they're not they are not a choice of a free individual living in a free society. बहुत बंदिश्ट है society में, and this bandisht cannot be done away with until we find a real choice, a true choice, a choice that people. So that's where the idea of within comes in. Within means something inside you, some essential self. um so yeah, okay, there is no line specifically that can make you understand what within is, but what he says is that there is some kind of value system that we all hold, or if not a value system, then unfortunately maybe some of us have been indoctrinated or manipulated into believing certain lies about ourselves or about the world. So that is the within, our internal world, right? So the without represents the external scarce world, and the within is the internal, also again the scarce internal world. So I mean, it doesn't necessarily within doesn't necessarily have to be a scarce world, but in this very specific context, he's talking about a scarce internal world. Then he talks about, then he says, if much has been written about harmony, discussions on freedom are endless. For the case before us, we shall limit ourselves to saying that freedom implies self-determination. Although very different ideas may be held regarding the nature of this self that determines itself, and there can be many interpretations of the meaning of determination. We can also prescind from any treatment of the manipulations of freedom so familiar in democratic technocracies calculated to please voters and win them votes. Again, so what I was talking about earlier, the manipulation of freedom, familiar in democratic technocracy. I think we don't need to get into the nitty-gritties of every single word he's saying, but let's try to understand the basic idea. Calculated to please voters and win their votes. I feel like this is very self-explanatory. Nor shall we enter upon sociological considerations. Our commentary will be restricted to the thesis that an imposed peace is a contradiction. that there is no peace without freedom, and that authentic peace can only be won in a regime of freedom. For our purposes, we can equivalate freedom with an acknowledgement of the dignity of a person, which accordingly is incompatible with the degradation of that person to a mere means or a simple tool for higher ends. Depriving people of their freedom, which the prevailing penitentiary system seems to think is the right way to go about things, must be included to any list of threats to peace. The criminal underworld, so frequently made up of ex cons, knows all about that. What we have nowadays is a secularized Christian theologmenon. I'm sorry, I don't know what that means. But I mean, I do understand his larger idea here. In bygone times, penances were imposed in an effort to convert the sinner, and it was believed that a certain reparation would won forgiveness for the fault. To this end, punishment was applied. No state believes this today. So this we can understand actually very beautifully in the case of the Nirbhaya rape case victims. So we see a lot of feminists and a lot of intellectuals argue that capital punishment is not going to dissuade anybody from raping, any man from raping a woman, or anybody from raping anybody. Because like they said that punishment, it was once believed that punishment can it will lead to people feeling sorry and hence changing their ways. But what the idea of penance only instills fear, never hope. And without hope, there cannot be a radical change. I mean, fear can also lead to a radical change, but never a radical positive change. It will never lead to peace. And if what we want from capital punishment is the end of rape, or at least the reduction of rape cases, then which is a kind of not a kind of peace we want peace, then that can never be achieved through non peaceful methods, right? Like, it makes perfect sense to us, but for some reason when we hear about such atrocities being committed, our anger, our boiling anger comes to the surface, and we are like, no, this man must be castrated, or he must be hung, or he must be not hung, hanged, or he must be, there must be dire consequences to his actions. And I think that the most revolutionary response is love. And I think we often forget that it is only through love, it is only through some kind of forgiveness that we can generate a peaceful society. Okay, so I'm going to read on. Today, simply those who have transgressed the law are deprived of freedom and are sometimes sentenced to prison terms of hundreds of years, as with the old indulgences. Here we have another case of mental inertia. The only thing we assert is that the penitentiary system, is not an institution of peace. So then he's also giving an example of how by taking away a man's right to their freedom, like some kind of life imprisonment or solitary confinement, where you restrict their movement, where you stop them from being a regular human being, how that drives people mad. That I mean, it is not to say, I don't think he's in any way saying that, that's a great, great way of dealing with, criminals, but it is to say that look at what just the absence of freedom does to a man, and how penance needs to be reduced until ultimately we find a more peaceful, more harmonious way of dealing with criminals, hardened criminals in the society. So I think ultimately he is implicitly talking about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If all of you know about that, if not, I would urge you all to look it up. Okay, moving on. Our first ingredient for peace, harmony, helps us to resolve the so-called conflict of freedoms, a concept that so often has served to crush quantitative or qualitative minorities. Obviously, there are conflicts amongst the aspirations of different individuals. All freedom presupposes self-determination within an accepted, acknowledged, or given order. Not everything is as simple as traffic regulations. Men are not machines running on wheels, constrained to travel pre-constructed routes. Neither a car nor its driver is a free being. Personal freedom means the recognition of one's own as well as another's autonomy. The promise of autonomy is that the ultimate structure of reality is harmonious, and that consequently the plenitude of one being stands in a relation with the perfection of totality. This is a very profound statement, and it's a little difficult to understand at its face value. But so why I said why I emphasized on autonomy was because he didn't say autonomy, he said autonomy. So autonomy essentially means some kind of self-determination, but autonomy is something even higher than the self. It is a recognition of some universal force that, uh, you know, because of whom, or if you don't believe in God, like some energy that governs the harmony around us, that keeps life going, that there is constant creation and destruction. Why is that happening? Some force is responsible for that. So it is in recognition of that force that we can truly achieve peace, which is why he says that the premise of autonomy is that the ultimate structure of reality is harmonious, that the most ultimate form of our life of reality is in harmony, that if there is birth in one place, then there is death in another, and that somehow the universe stands in balance. And then he says that um, and that consequently the plenitude of one being stands in relation with the perfection of the totality. So it means that if I am somebody who has an abundance of love, that is or that is in relation to how the universe, to the kind of love that is held within this universe. I know this is all really spiritual, and a lot of people I know don't believe in any kind of god or any kind of higher being, but I do, so I'm gonna talk about it. And if people don't agree with it, I mean, you can just stop listening to me. But yeah, essentially it means that so yeah, it's also implicitly sort of encouraging us to ensure that everybody has plenty, that we're all living in a state of abundance, because it's only adding to the same in the universe, and that the in that we need to ensure harmony, and that if we think that by taking away from somebody that we'll get more, all we're really doing is sort of creating an imbalance in the universe. So he's not saying that the universe at all points is in balance, because there is always somebody, fiddling with, the like we see in our government. They're causing deaths, unnecessary deaths that didn't have to be caused. Those were not natural deaths, those are unnatural deaths. So that's already an imbalance in the state of affairs in the universe. So what they're saying is that you have to ensure that everybody has enough, that everybody feels satisfied, that the plenitude is in relation to the perfection of the totality. I hope I'm making sense. If not, then right, you can always talk to me about this and we can have a conversation. Yeah, okay, moving on. But there is more. Freedom is an anti-mechanistic notion. Without now entering upon the considerations of scientific apologetics, modern physics itself teaches us that even the laws of nature are indeterministic. The order or harmony of freedom is not automatically predictable, is not subject to once for all legislation, does not suppose a ready-made determined universe. Human freedoms are not statistically expressible factors, unlike those called with meaningful what? Irony, degrees of freedom in statistics. I think we can kind of skip this paragraph because it's a little unrelated to what I've been saying, and let's just listen to the next part, which I think is beautiful. This means that peace cannot be based on an immutable order in a fixed predetermined structure. Peace is not something like a field in which, after the calculation of each individual's respective degree of freedom, behavior is legislated that will respect those degrees. In other words, it cannot be legislated once and for all. Peace cannot be legislated once and for all. And if it can be legislated, then it would not be peace any more than love can be commanded, which essentially says that peace is not a predetermined state. Peace is not a ordained state. Peace is not, hey, I'm going to give you peace and you better be peaceful. It's not an order. Just like love is not a command, it happens, you know. Peace has nothing in common with the rigidity of a freedom in which each atom is assigned a determined space lest it disturb its neighbor. Peace must be created and recreated continuously. Its analog here is the creatio continua, which means inevitability of the infinite. I looked this up. Of Christian scholasticism, which, being a free act of the Creator, has incorporated the latter's freedom into the very nature of things. So, I mean, through this paragraph, I hope you understand how the idea of freedom and peace is antithetical to right-wing politics, because it very outrightly says that it is incompatible with a predetermined structure, and right-wing politics is all about, you know, having a rigid structure with one person in command who tells you what to do, what is right, what is wrong. So that kind of order and those kind of politics and that kind of governance can never lead to peace. If peace implies and requires a regime of freedom, and its freedom means respect for the autonomy of the human person, really would like you to keep listening to the emphasis on autonomy, because that's very important. It follows immediately that peace cannot be imposed. It must be received, earned, created, as we have been saying. Received, earned, created. Are you listening to the connotations of these three words? Peace as a gift, peace as something you have to work for, peace as a creation, something that, you know, there's some kind of divine intervention there. Again, for all you atheists, I'm so sorry. This is probably your least favorite. I'm sure you must be cringing with any kind of reference to any divinity, but too bad. There is no peace in the presence of tyranny or dictatorship of any kind, individual or institutional, sacred or profane. To put it another way, the ultimate subject of freedom is not the individual but being, reality in its totality. So this is why those who believe that that capitalism can never breed peace, because in capitalism we believe that if a few have a lot, then firstly we already know trickle down effect doesn't work. But anyways, because of their belief that, oh, if we have a lot, we can give it to those who need it, you know, eventually it will go to those. But it never does. It stays with the rich, and the rich think that, well, because we have a lot, we also have factories where these poor people can work. Like, great, right? At least someone's happy. But that's never how it works, because it's never freedom and peace are never individual concepts. They're always collective concepts. And by collective, he means beyond a society, beyond a community. He's talking about the universe. It doesn't just mean human beings. It means the ecology, the environment. It means every single living being in its, or, you know, living harmoniously. So it's not like, oh, I can like cut a tree, but then I feed the poor and somehow that gets neutralized. It's not how it fucking works. So there will be tyrants if they are more powerful than... wait, what? Where were we? Right. If individuals seek to isolate themselves from the totality, they will never be free. They will be tyrants if they are more powerful than their neighbors, but the latter will continue to impose conditions on them, if only negatively. Another person in his or her quality as aliened, something else, will always be alienating, hence coercive. Only when the alien is discovered... I'm sorry, these are like Latin words, even meanings that even I don't understand, so please just try to understand the larger message. Only when the alien is discovered to be an alias, someone else, another I, can he or she be converted into a you and come to form part of a supra-individual identity, so that her or his challenges will no longer just be a series of coercions of our freedom, but a higher form of freedom. Without love, then, there is no freedom, as the wisdom of ages knows so well. Freedom, before being a right of the individual, is the character of reality. Like, just think about it a little. Hence, it is not a question of my ego renouncing its freedom in order that other egos may also be free, but rather a matter of factoring their freedom by diluting myself as an individual and appearing as a person. Only one resurrected is free and a factor for peace. Oh, this is Panikkar on justice. The area on the right in the space sign represents justice, and indeed, right wing ideology seems to have more affinity for a just order than for a presumably more dangerous freedom. And you'd wonder why he's saying that. And so, when I was reading this, my interpretation of this was perhaps this, that a right wing government, a right wing politics, it believes in hierarchies, everything in its place, and a place for everything. And freedom often implies some kind of anarchy, which is why he's saying that you would think that right wing politics has a greater affinity for that. But I would also urge you to think about freedom and order and justice in a more nuanced way. Because if he says that order, okay, he actually says that later into the chapter, but order is not simply a kind of static structure. Order is a cosmic order. So if you think about it, even the right wing politics does not it does not comply with this kind of order. And in fact, politics itself cannot ever encompass any of these values, because they lie in the realm of faith, they lie in the realm of experience, not really in the intellect, not really in the everydayness of life, in the structures of, which is why he says, right, that the universal symbol that everybody understands and that is a unifying factor amongst the is a universal factor is not God or democracy or some economic structure or policy, it's peace. This is why that is, because politics and God and religion, any institution cannot, it cannot encompass and embody the enormity of peace. And he's trying to understand what is that enormity that we are missing, where is the nuance. So he says, without justice there is no peace, and justice donates not only the Roman conception of institutia, it includes that of dharma as well, among many other things. So dharma is the element of cohesiveness in the universe. The dharma is justice, the fitting order and natural place of things. Thus, justice stands in direct contradiction with violence. Remember, in Sadhana, Rabindranath Tagore, he talks about dharma being man's highest purpose, his that gives him his unique identity, and how that unique self, is in constant it's constantly seeking the universe, the consummation of the self and the infinity. So it is the same dharma that he's talking about, or albeit he's putting it in different words. Why is he talking about dharma being the fitting order? Because it's man's purpose, your true purpose in life. How do you fit into this world? What is your reason of being? Where do you fit into this puzzle of this cosmic total? Justice, peace, and joy are characteristics of the reign of God, says Paul in the passage that has not been the object of adequate meditation. The criterion is gladness, joy, and spirit. So again, he's making a connection between justice and joy, and how. And again, I would like you to think about Tagore and how he says that joy is an end in itself, and if justice is an element of peace, and if peace is a kind of if peace denotes a kind of universal order, and if every element of peace also does the same, then how can it not denote joy, which is the ultimate pursuit of man, and which is the ultimate destination of man? An unjust peace is not only fragile and fleeting, it is not peace at all, properly speaking. For our purposes, let us limit ourselves to saying that justice attributes to each being that which belongs to it, what is that being's own and its due. Here too, the trait emerges that we have seen in the other two ingredients of peace. Justice is a fundamental relation. Justice refers to our relation with others. Analogously, peace is not an interioristic affair having only an interior dimension. Inward peace requires and demands outer peace, as you have said. I told you, right, that peace cannot just be an interior, it cannot only have one dimension, it's both interior and exterior. And also understand how he talks about justice being a fundamental relation. in through this he's trying to talk about the same thing that Gandhi talked about. I don't know in what chapter this was, but he was talking about rights and responsibilities. How, if we are fighting for our rights, we are also fighting to be responsible for those rights, right? It's not simply to say, I want to vote, but it is to say that I want to also gather enough education to vote for the right thing, which is the best for this community, which is best for me. So, which is why justice is relational, and why it is imperative to not only see it through its interior dimension, which is the dimension of rights, but also its exterior, which is the dimension of the responsibility. It's a cycle. I fight for my rights to take responsibility for my community. Rights cannot just be done for the sake of winning that argument. It must be done for a greater good. The major problem of peace and its relation with justice consists in this cultivation and acquisition in situations of injustice, especially institutionalized injustice. So he explains what he means by that through three considerations of peace. Okay, and these are very important. I would like you to pay careful attention to what he's saying here. So first, peace is a problem precisely because it presents itself as a goal in an unpeaceful situation. And what does he mean by that? Just as the true problem of tolerance arises in the presence of concrete intolerance, so the authentic problem of peace arises when one finds oneself in confrontation with unjust situations. It is easy enough to orate about justice as a cause and condition of peace, but that does not solve the problem. So essentially what he's trying to say here is that the reason we don't achieve peace is because we make peace the target, while peace is a gift of the problem which lies elsewhere. So the root of the problem must be the target, not peace itself. Peace is something that you receive. Peace is not something you fight for, because that already defeats the purpose of and the attainment of peace. To think that in order to attain peace or to live at peace, we must go back to the beginning is tantamount to declaring peace to be impossible. So think about this think about it as an illness. Okay, when you get an illness, do you target the illness or do you target the symptoms? This illness is an internal problem. The illness is where the roots of the virus lies, but the symptoms are an outward display of that illness. And oftentimes why we see conflict in the world is because we tend to see the conflict itself as the problem, because of which there is further conflict, and then it just becomes like a never ending cycle. And again, there is an implication of the internal and the external world, the internal world of finding the root of the problem versus the external world of the symptoms of the problem, which are often seen as the root, because I guess because of the sensory nature of the modern world, and not the intuitive nature, not the insightful nature of the world. Because of that sensory nature of the world, we end up completely losing sight of the most important dimension of human existence, which is the interior dimension, which is where the problem lies, through which there is an actual possibility of receiving peace. So he says that we have criticized interiorism, the withdrawal to peace to the sphere of the individual and the interior. Peace is relational, and every relation has at least two poles. But then he also says that even as we do need to get to the root of the problem, even as we do need to focus on the spiritual, we can't do that at the cost of the external. So ultimately, even as there is a very clear distinction between the interior and the exterior, even as he's writing through he is writing a critique of the external, he's also cautioning to the complete dismissal of the external, because the totality of things consists of both the interior and the exterior. And if we have any shot of receiving peace, it would be by looking at both those aspects, not just one of them. And so there is the second consideration here. So he says that the second two considerations impel us to not accept simple interior peace as a sufficient answer. One is precisely that peace is inseparable from justice, and justice, as we have said, is a relation. And relation is constitutive of human person and all reality. Again, remember Rabindranath Tagore's self and the infinity, constantly the self consummating in the universe. One cannot have peace, not even interior peace, if one isolates oneself from the world. The attitude of the Bodhisattva or the Christian is the most realistic. We're all set in a relation and are interdependent. The authentic monk enters into solitude in order to defeat and transcend isolation. So essentially, he's also saying that to walk away from a difficult exterior world is it's not even interior peace. It is at best you exercising privilege and being a selfish asshole. Another consideration militating against the interiorism of seeking a merely inner peace by detaching oneself from the maddening crowd is this inherent elitism, if not selfishness, of such a posture. Very few of us can withdraw from involvement in outward injustices. So actually in the previous paragraph, he doesn't, so he talks about this privilege and this selfishness in this paragraph. In the last paragraph, what he actually meant to say was that when you retreat from the outside, it is not to enter, it is not as much a retreat, it is not as much a retreat as it is a coming together, so there is a difference between isolation and solitude. I can be alone but not lonely, so which is why the idea of the totality of things, and why only interior peace is actually impossible, because even unless you're completely alone and isolated, you can't actually sort of be disconnected from the total, the harmonious, the whole. Anyways, the next paragraph. Very few of us can withdraw from involvement in outward injustices, not for want of any moral courage, but by reason of human impossibility. To think that one can withdraw to a merely inner peace if one has sufficient spiritual formation, intellectual cognition, and socio-economic comfort is to forget that man is a person, not just an individual. It is to forget your humanity. Circumstances affect human beings too. My I includes my circumstance, and the latter, in many cases, does not allow me such and such a comfortable distance. If the snipers are in the street, if exploitation is rampant, if it is a matter of my child's bread or my own subsistence, if withdrawal from the res publica is not neutrality but cowardice, is not a political choice but being an asshole, if not wanting to make a difficult decision is thereby to make a cowardly decision, if I live in more or less of a concentration camp, then it is impossible to speak of an exclusively interior peace, because my very interior has been invaded by exteriority. I have shared this quote on my Instagram story, which says, I forgot who said it, but that to be adjusted to a profoundly sick society is not a sign of good health. This is the long and short of what he's saying in this paragraph. So let us repeat. If anyone thinks that suffering is always ennobling, that oppression does not necessarily demean a person to a level of animal, or that misery is not degrading, this is because that person is thinking about all this and has not been deprived of the voice of his very or her very thinking. It is all the more urgent to be the voice of the voiceless when the voiceless have become not only aphonic but mute. They no longer have anything to say. We cannot make a meditation on a peace while comfortably entrenched in our manifold fortresses. So this is why grassroots level activism is very, very important, that you cannot sit in your high throne and talk about, pain and degradation when you perhaps are part of the structure that is allowing that kind of degradation to happen, precisely because you haven't experienced it, perhaps precisely because there is an intellectual pursuit of understanding it rather than really living it. And which is why I've constantly been asking all of you to sort of shed your your immediate instinct to intellectualize what he's trying to say and really understand it from like a deeper part of you, because what he's saying is a truism. Some things that you can't explain, although he's done a very good job at intellectually explaining those truisms, but which are true, they resound within you at your deepest core. So the first consideration was that the peace is a problem precisely because it presents itself as a goal to an unpeaceful situation. And the second consideration is that justice must not be confused with legality. And here Gandhi would also agree. So he says that peace is not content with lawfulness. Peace aspires to justice. But justice does not materialize in a vacuum. Here we collide with the excruciating problem of means and ends. Most wars have been undertaken on the pretext of defending justice, a just cause. It has been said since Saint Augustine is the first requisite for the justification of an act of war. So he's talking about three kind of false conceptions of justice, of lawfulness. One is a slavishness to the past, a refusal to question tradition. The second is rebellion to the current order, which is a refusal to accept any kind of not authority, but I would say more like wisdom. If somebody is telling you something because you have the right to question, you will consistently question. And so here he gives the example of an absolutization of democracy, and he gives the example of how the opposition will use its right to be able to speak against those in power in the name of defending the constitution and some kind of values. And and in the name of legality, all they're really doing is wasting your time. So think about it also as the argument of censorship, and how technically hate speech is also free speech. So why should we not talk about hateful things? So that's again saying that understand that just because you can doesn't mean you should. That justice and legality are not the same thing. And the third kind of false conception of justice in the name of legality is empty lawfulness. And here he talks about how just listening to what is being told to you. And he says that many dictatorships were perfectly legal. Slavery was legal. तो अगर कोई तुम्हें बोलेगा कि तुम मेरे पैर चाटो क्योंकि मैं पावर में हूँ, तो तुम उनके पैर चाटोगे. तो this is where Gandhi comes in, where he talks about the necessity to revolt against and agitate against unjust laws. And again, I'm going to quote that again, I cannot remember perfectly, that says when injustice becomes law, revolt becomes duty, dissent becomes duty. That's what he's saying. So this was the second consideration of peace. The third consideration of peace, before I do that, let me just end this properly. So he says that the realization of peace calls for more than an attachment to an antecedently established legality. Peace and justice alike demand more. And also again, remember what I've spoken about Harsh Mandar's line, where he said that justice must be tempered on compassion. And those are the values that you must look for in a just order, not legality. Because a lot of unjust laws, a lot of brutal laws have been legal in the past and in the present. So, the third consideration of peace is that peace, like justice, points to transcendence, to something accepted as indisputable and regarded as outside the interplay of factors that help or hinder peace. So he says that we understand transcendence here in its literal sense, something out beyond the ingredients of a question. The model example possibly is God, but it could likewise be any other prevailing myth. Above, we have cited the constitution and democracy, and we have indicated the state. A recognition that establishment of peace requires a criterion, a norm or pole that enables us to speak of peace and that transcends the litigating parties is no problem whatsoever. The phenomenology of transcendency is not very problematic. The difficulty is in its material recognition, in its concrete notion. Hence our discussion on myth. Myth is indisputable simply because it is not disputed. So this may sound very complicated to you all, but I'm going to make it really simple. And I would like to thank my friend Himani Sanjeti for sending me her essay on myth making, and I would really urge you all to read it. If you want to read it, just DM me or just write in the comments and I'll DM you the link. So essentially, myth making is just a long believed tradition which has gone unquestioned, which is why he says that myth is indisputable simply because it has not been disputed. So he is making a connection to myth and transcendence. And again, I would like you to remember the idea of the transcendental in connection to my previous video on Panikkar, where I talk about rebuilding a society through reconciliation, and how there are two outcomes. One is a scapegoat and the second is a transcendental authority. So he's saying exactly that a transcendental is often a myth, and the problem is that shouldn't be the case, because for peace to prevail, we must be able to accept without doubt that it's the best for all of us. But as it often happens in myths, that because it assumes an uncriticality, because it often sounds almost like a superstition, that it is actually not the best for us all, and we become mere slaves to that myth rather than becoming sort of active agents of achieving the goals of that transcendental power. I hope I'm making sense. So essentially, it's a traditional dogma, an inability to shed the past to create new meaning in the present and create a blueprint for the future. So it is uncontested and it lacks critical thought. This is something I've written. I think I've written it well, which is why I said it out loud. So then he gives a whole example. He says that an example will spare us some ink. One may think that today's military system is unjust. One may even think that the institution of the armed forces is the greatest obstacle to peace. It is obvious that legality is not on this person's side, which is why he says justice is not legality. Many others will attack such an opinion, reproaching it for not only being naive but unjust to a society where such an hypothesis would be rendered defenseless. मतलब अगर military नहीं है तो हमारे पास defense नहीं है, we are vulnerable to attack, and if you think military हटाओ, that means you don't care about the nation, blah 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 blah. So he says that our intention here is not to broach a discussion of the specific matter, but to examine the foundation. This example is not of a conscientious objector, which is confined to the decision of the individual and to the series of risks that such a discussion might entail. It is a problem not of individualistic morality, but one that concerns a society's justice, without which a real lasting peace cannot be achieved. And I would also like you to think about this in terms of if you know about Afzal Guru's hanging. So remember, there was this term used that we need to kill him, we need him to die to clear the country's conscience. So that's what he says, that the only plausible justification for such kind of laws is that one recognizes a transcendency on which one confers an authority which conjures away all scruples of conscience. मतलब अगर तुम किसी ऐसी चीज़ को authority जो तुमसे ऊपर है, then you're like, okay, that can do the thinking for me. I don't have to feel bad. I can just, blame it there, as if you have no role in keeping that kind of unjust structure in place. So that's what he says, the idea of the greater good, kill for the greater good. Totally irrational, like it is a hollow argument, it is baseless, there is no substance, there is no truth, no grounding to such belief systems, and yet we find ourselves repeating it, that, oh no, that person. So he's not talking about some kind of cosmic order, he's talking about this false structure which attributes to itself, or to which we attribute some kind of authority to make conscientious decisions for us, rather than being conscientious individuals ourselves, critical thinking individuals ourselves, to dumb our minds and kill our conscience. So this problem cannot be sidestepped in any serious reflection on peace. The most flagrant case is that of guerrilla war. and what is called terrorism. If violence is not a solution, still less will state or legal violence be. Giving it a legal form won't change the giving it a legal form won't change the content or the consequences. So what I mean when I've written that is that if you change the form, it won't change the content. Okay? As long as the two parties do not commune in the same myth, there will be no peace. But myth is the acknowledgement of the transcendent. So he says that instead of that myth, why don't we take a look at this myth, which is, in order that there be peace on earth, the angels of heaven must sing, which is Luke, some Bible line. Sorry, I don't know. So in translation, it means that without a radical anthropological cosmological change, individuals cannot democratically bestow upon themselves the peace that they do so rationally desire. मतलब जब तक तुम इंसानियत के बारे में नहीं सोचोगे, तुम्हें peace मिल ही नहीं सकता. So it has to be a benevolent peace. It cannot be a brutal peace. And so now we enter into the last section of this chapter, and it is called Complexity of Peace. So here he says, we have described the three ingredients of peace, which is harmony, justice, and freedom, and the problems have mounted. We have yet to examine the proportion of these ingredients. How to combine harmony, freedom, and justice? Which of them is to rule the others? When we attempt to impose in the name of God or a certain concept of justice or a party, a race, a civilization, a culture, or a religion, a certain order, peace does not follow. Our triadic symbol implies a confidence precisely in the trinity that constitutes it. A fundamental human act consists in one's self-recognition. Okay, before I move on, he essentially says that peace cannot be an imposition, and he constantly reiterates it, that a conception of the triadic structure of peace and its imposition can never lead to true and lasting peace. And then he goes on to say that our triadic symbol implies a confidence precisely in the trinity that constitutes it. A fundamental human act consists in one's self-recognition as living reality. This acknowledgement leads to a kind of cosmic confidence in which reality is real. We have neither the duty nor the power either to create or justify reality. We have to live reality. And by living it, transform it. So essentially, he's trying to say that in this triadic symbolism, the three values that constitute it, it bestows upon us a belief that reality is real. And how do we know that reality is real? Not because we create it, not because we have the power to create it or the duty to do the same, but because we are living in that reality. And hence, because we are aware of that reality, we also have the ability to transform it. And that's again where the triadic structure comes into the picture, because through that triadic structure, through that the truest sense of peace, can we transform this very reality. Reality is not simple here. It becomes, of course, and we cooperate in the endeavor. But this very activity belongs to reality. That means that experience enjoys a primacy over experiment. Consciousness of life over thinking. Experience, as its very name suggests, is a traversing of something immediately given. Experiment manipulates the data, but ultimately must have recourse to experiences that are irreducible to others. So, I mean, he is talking about how I think it's pretty self-explanatory where he says that experience is primal and experiment is like it happens later. That first you experience, then you experiment. Like think about gravity, right? That the apple fell on Newton's head. After which he was like, how? He experienced gravity, then he conducted an experiment to prove it. So it's the primal experience. Experience, as its very name suggests, is a traversing of something immediately given. In the case before us, none of our three elements has the hegemony over the others. None is manipulable at the expense of others. Circularity and interdependence are constitutive. Herein consists concord. So exactly, he talks about why how experiments manipulates data, but experiences are irreducible. Which is why in this triadic structure, there is no hegemony of one over the other. They're all given equal space, and how they all depend on one another, and how it's a circle and it's a cycle, and yeah. So, what we wish to indicate with all this consists of two thoughts. I know this is a little complex, but bear with me, he's going to explain everything. The first is that cosmic confidence is necessity. Cosmic confidence in necessity is the ontological premise of even knowing what mistrust is. Cosmic confidence in necessity is the ontological premise of for knowing even what mistrust is. We shall not now enter into the theological problem of monotheism or the philosophical problem of being. We shall limit ourselves to a description of this sort of cosmic trust in a reality that is simply given, that is here, that we have not ourselves made. Reality is causa sui, said the old philosophers. I think it means that it just is. Reality has no need of anyone to check up on it in order to be, or of any argument in order to be proved. On what would such a check or argument be based? Unless one existed, one could not inquire into one's existence. The question of being or nothingness would not be posed were there no existing to pose it. I hope all of you are following. I think it's very clear what he's trying to say. The degree of objectivity of our experience is another matter. Our only point, cosmic confidence, which differs from epistemological certitude as well as concrete interpretation. We give this trust, is an ontic necessity superior to logical principle of non. Okay. So he says that we know we exist because we experience reality, and this is different from epistemological certitude, which is some kind of scientific, like some degree of research into it, and it's also different from us understanding reality perfectly for what it is. He's talking about like the most basic, the simplest belief that we are real is just because we exist, and the fact that we have the ability to question our reality and our existence. So that, yeah, I think this is so beautiful. I don't know what all of you think, but I think all of this is so beautiful. The second thought to which we have referred expresses the dynamism of all reality, which moved Pythagorean Philolaos of Croton to say, harmony consists in the union of multiple things mixed, and in the community of spirit of those who think in divergent ways, which is to say that peace is not a static reality. So I hope also that that's very clear to all of you. Again, like what we talked about harmony, when I said that harmony includes everything in its place, the good and the bad, which is why it makes for a dynamic it's a dynamic whole. It's not a static whole, which is why I said that politics and any kind of structure can never truly embody what it means, what justice means, what order means, what harmony means, because structure in its meaning already assumes a kind of very specific static place, while here it's not कि मैंने decide कर लिया और यही रहेगा. There's space to change, even as there is a space allotted only for you, if that makes sense, right? And he explains that later. So whatever you don't understand right now, either you can of course ask me in the comments, but I think he will explain that later, and I think that it should be made clear to whoever is listening. This leads us to a new consideration with regard to the peace sign. Also, yeah, do you know why that peace sign exists in the first place? Like, this is the peace sign you've seen, right? So this is why this peace sign exists, because it actually has 3 elements in it. Fascinating, right? Okay, I don't know if that's actually why it exists, or if he's created meaning in those three elements? Please somebody look that up for me. So this leads us to a new consideration with regard to the peace sign. The three fields of peace are delimited by a circle. This symbolizes three more aspects of peace: a circle of equal centered spaces. The circle represents the fact that peace is limited by its surface and unlimited by its circumference. Peace is not infinite, as neither is a circle. It is no different with a concrete human condition and particular situation. There is no such thing as an infinite peace. Peace is a tangible, concrete, limited thing, which it is possible to enjoy. It is not a utopia. Peace is on a human scale, although it can always grow, just as a circle too can become larger. Peace can grow only on one condition, that the circle hold. That is, that it keep equidistant from the center, that it keep a balance in the three fields so that the latter remain equal. So he's saying two things by that even as it is not infinite, that it always has the capacity to grow, but it can only do so if the balance remains constant. And again, he's talking about the totality of things. He's talking about the cosmic order and how if there is imbalance, there is conflict and not peace. And also explains why this must be a circle, because only in a circle can this very concept, this very fundamental concept of peace be explained best. So now he says, now a circle is limited by its own circumference, and the latter is indefinite in itself. A circumference has no beginning or end. Any point can be its beginning, and at any point we can postulate that it ends. But what constitutes the circumference is its center. The circumference refers to, bears on, its center and nothing else. And again, by center he means the essence, the root, the very core of things. Now, as that every point is equidistant from the center, we have no natural criterion for saying where the circumference begins and where it ends. So peace, like human plenitude, is undefined. Every person in each society has his or her and its own peace or its own lack of peace. Three spaces must be equal signifies balance that ought to reign among harmony, freedom and justice in order for there to be peace. Any imbalance alters it. The balance is precisely peace, but it cannot be established by any of its parts. If this balance, this peace, commands justice, as it were, freedom and harmony will suffer. And the same can be said of the dominion of either of the other two. Hence the fact that many traditions have declared peace as a gift, something given and received, but incapable of being manipulated, even by the will, however good the latter might be. Again, peace cannot be achieved even by the victory of good guys, because peace is not a victory, it's a gift. Finally, as we have said, in order that the three spaces may be equal within the circle, they need to be centered on the same center of the circumference that shapes the cross of peace. The center is the locus of love. Love centers the three ingredients of peace and is the criterion of their equilibrium. There is no question, obviously, of a love that is pure sentiment or pure will. Rather, the love of which we are speaking here is the love that ancients call eros. The Gospel agape and the Vedas kama, which was in the beginning. And which being the first gem of life is more sublime than the gods. This is the transcendental love. We are referring obviously to the primordial force that is the naturalis motum omnium rerum, which moves the whole hor erominum, I'm so sorry guys, there are too many Latin words. Let's ignore this. Human peace, then the peace of our experience, is not the ultimate reality. Peace seems to have an intriguing instability. Interesting. So we wish to indicate that in its complexity, peace is neither natural nor supernatural. It is rather metanatural. So I'm going to explain that through my conversation with my Professor Asim, who taught me this text. I asked him what I understood by these three terms, and he gave me a very good response. It seemed that I had kind of got a sense of them, but he kind of filled in the gaps. So when he says that peace is not natural, he says that this is because the three elements are in contention with each other, and it is not easy for humans for humanity to maintain the balance. So, just like transcendental love, although the essence of creation is often is seen as some kind of ideal, is because it is very difficult for any individual to successfully achieve it, because it requires us to let go of all our base needs and to sort of like aspire and attain our highest selves, which is why it's not natural, it is not easy to find. And more than that, it requires faith, otherwise there would be disturbance and hence conflict. So that's another thing that it implies, that because it's transcendental, and transcendental implies a kind of faith in something higher than just what your immediate reality is, and without that faith, without that belief in the out above, there can't be peace, there will only be conflict. And again, think about the transcendental in the reconciliation discussion that I did with you. And when he says that it is not supernatural, he means that when we understand supernatural, we think myth, we think superstition. So, and a myth is based on some kind of revelation by some god, and it's just when you understand that kind of revelation through the intellect, it just understand, okay, I'm just going to make it very simple. It's not natural because it requires faith, it requires a belief in the transcendental. It's not supernatural because it is more than a myth. It is metanatural because it is a part of a cosmic totality, it is part of something greater than us. And here you can think about this in terms of Krishna's role in Mahabharata, where he lets a lot of bad things happen because he understands a kind of cosmic order where certain deaths need to happen in order for there to be a greater win for humanity. So that's why it's meta. Meta means existence. It's something that's at the deepest core of nature. Something that you can't see, something that's not behind, that's not like in, that's not it's not sensory, it's not intellectual, it lies somewhere deep in your soul, somewhere in your most in the highest but also the deepest part of you, right? That making sense? I know this is really abstract, but try to understand the meaning, please. So he says that peace is not a simple state of mind, it is rather a state of being. Peace is that state of being which corresponding to the being in question. Okay, I don't know what that means. He means that when a being is in its place, it is at peace. When a bone, an individual, or a society is not in its place, it is not at peace. The bone hurts, the individual is disturbed, the society is unstable, and so with every being. The place of which we speak is not a predetermined space or a static locality in which each being occupies its spot in a rank and file, as in a regiment on parade, nor is each part localized after the manner of a part functioning in a machine. Instead of place, we could have said duty, dharma, highest purpose. Peace emerges when a being complies with its duty. But here again, the metaphor could be misunderstood. The duty in question is not the extrinsic one. Each being's ought to be is its being where it belongs. Again, there is an idea of belonging, of community, of being part of something bigger than yourself. Each being fulfills its function. Think about R&T, Rabindranath Tagore. That shows us that the difficulty will lie in the discovery of this place, duty, or function. We have spoken above of the cosmic order. A theist could call it the will of God, a state of being. We said at the beginning, that state that corresponds to a being. So one is in one's place when one has peace, and one has peace when one is in one's place. There is peace when a society is integrated into the cosmic order, and when the society is integrated into the cosmic order, there's peace. So peace pertains to the ultimate order of things. So there is no ulterior reference point. And so he says that it will be said that an out of place tibia hurts because its place is visible to everyone, because you can see it. But a place of the individual, as it depends on other things, because there is so much interdependence, cannot be known with such precision, since this same will, being free, will frequently have doubts about its decisions. A community. So remember here it said that I talked about how people having their own place and how it's not a static thing. This is why it can't be static. Even as man has his own purpose in life, he also has free will, which means there will always be doubts and change and sort of indecisions and a change of sort of you'll decide one thing and then suddenly you'll realize, oh no, I actually want to do that. Ultimately you will achieve your destiny, but in each step you might not follow some kind of predetermined order, but you will still be at peace, because it's the higher end that we are looking at, not each individual step, which is why life is a journey, life is a climb. It's not about how fast we get there, it's not about what's waiting on the other side, it's the climb. Miley Cyrus, you are God. A community has peace when it is integrated into an internal and external order that permits the autonomic realization of all its components. And again, he talks about autonomic, not autonomic. Always listen to that. But peace is the very criterion. So finally, he concludes with what the conception of peace is, and this is like he's given us 8 different points. All of this carries us to a far deeper and more realistic conception of peace. It shows us in the first place that A, peace is not a static state, and that accordingly it is found to be constantly in theory, means I think it movement. Secondly, it shows us that peace is neither purely subjective nor exclusively objective, it is relational. Thirdly, it shows us that peace is never perfect. That is, it is never finished and complete. It's constantly in motion. Fourth, it shows us that peace is not available to precise definitions because of its character of ultimacy. Fifth, it shows us that peace has no bi-univocal relationship with the rest of reality. I can be at peace with others without others being at peace with me. Sixth, it shows us that peace is not a monolithic block. It is polyfaceted and even pluralistic. It has facets, degrees, nuances. It is not a subject to quantifications, since these very facets are not homogeneous. And finally, it shows us that peace is the relation that joins us equitably and with freedom to a harmonious whole. So that is his whole entire conception of peace. So yes, this was the video. These were the videos for today, and I hope you didn't only enjoy it, but you also understood what he was trying to say, and that he's given you a lot of food for thought, and that he's making you understand that, you know, the modern world, it gives a lot of importance to science and intellect, but the truth of reality actually lies beyond these two realms and these two sort of aspects of human nature, human capabilities. And if to understand people like Rabindranath Tagore and Panikkar, you need to possess some degree of faith, if not entirely commit to some faith, because it cannot be intellectualized. Because there will be too many intellectual holes which will make you completely dismiss this truism, the wisdom of his words. So yeah, I hope it has been a transformative experience to listen to Panikkar, as it has been for me to read him, and that I hope that you pick up his book and read this for yourself, because I'm just giving you my take on it. I'm sure if my professor was teaching this, he would have a lot more to say. I'm just his student, so I only have as much to say as I have experienced in life. So yes, that is that.